Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Hi, Valerie.
Hi, Catherine. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. It's amazing to see your face, and just so grateful that we get to have this conversation.
Me too. And I love hearing your daughter crying in the background. Actually, I feel like my husband is holding the children downstairs, keeping them from like bursting through the door. Your
Yes.
daughter's, I mean, here we are. This is what it looks like to show up to the work.
Yes, exactly. It looks insane some days, or just all over the place some days, and it's messy and beautiful, and yeah, really grateful. So hello to everyone who's joining us live on Facebook. I'm here. I'm Catherine Orsborn. I direct the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign, and I'm here with Valarie Kaur, who is many things. She is a Sikh activist. She's a lawyer. She's a filmmaker. She's a mother. She's so many different things. I'm grateful to call her a friend in this work, and a teacher in so many ways as well. And instead of reading a bio on Valarie, we thought we would start this by getting a chance to see her in action through a video from New Year's Eve 2016, the moments between the 2016 elections and the inauguration of Trump. And I think that this video speaks so powerfully to who Valarie is and what she is bringing into this world. So we'll go to this video and then we'll jump into conversation.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. On Christmas Eve, 103 years ago, my grandfather waited in a dark and dank cell. He sailed by steamship across the Pacific Ocean from India to America, leaving behind colonial rule. But when he landed on American shores, immigration officials saw his dark skin, his tall turban worn as part of his Sikh faith, and saw him not as a brother, but as foreign, as suspect, threw him behind bars where he languished for months. Until a single man, a white man, a lawyer named Henry Marshall, filed a writ of habeas corpus that released him Christmas Eve, 1913. My grandfather, Kehar Singh, became a farmer, free to practice the heart of his Sikh faith, love and oneness. And so when his Japanese American neighbors were rounded up and taken to their own detention camps in the deserts of America, he went out to see them when no one else would. He looked after their farms until they returned home. He refused to stand down. That's right. In the aftermath of September 11, when hate violence exploded in these United States and a man that I called uncle was murdered, I tried to stand up. I became a lawyer like the man who freed my grandfather, and I joined a generation of activists fighting detentions and deportation, surveillance and special registration, hate crimes and racial profiling. And after 15 years, with every film, with every lawsuit, with every campaign, I thought we were making the nation safer for the next generation. Mama. And then my son was born. On Christmas Eve, I watched him ceremoniously put the milk and cookies by the fire for Santa Claus. And after he went to sleep, I then drank the milk and ate the cookies. I wanted him to wake up and see them gone. In the morning, I wanted him to believe in a world that was magical. But I am leaving my son a world that is more dangerous than the one that I was given. Because we are raising a brown boy in America. A brown boy who may someday wear a turban as part of his faith. And in America today, as we enter an era of enormous rage, as white nationalists hail this moment as their great awakening, as hate acts against Sikhs and our Muslim brothers and sisters are at an all-time high. I know that there will be moments, whether on the streets or in the schoolyard, where my son will be seen as foreign, as suspect, as a terrorist. Just as black bodies are still seen as criminal. Brown bodies are still seen as illegal. Trans bodies are still seen as immoral. Indigenous bodies are still seen as savage. The bodies of women and girls seen as someone else's property. And when we see these bodies not as brothers and sisters, then it becomes easier to bully them, to rape them, to allow policies that neglect them, that incarcerate them, that kill them. Yes, Rabbi. The future is dark. On this New Year's Eve, this watch night, I close my eyes and I see the darkness of my grandfather's cell. And I can feel the spirit of ever-rising optimism in the Sikh tradition, Chardi Kala, within him. And so the mother in me asks, what if? What if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America... What if our America is not dead, but a country that is waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one long labor? What if all of our grandfathers and grandmothers are standing behind us now, those who survived occupation and genocide, slavery and Jim Crow, detentions and political assault? What if they're whispering in our ear today, tonight, you are brave? What if this is our nation's great transition? What does the midwife tell us to do? Breathe. And then, because if we don't push, we will die. If we don't push, our nation will die. Tonight, we will breathe. Tomorrow, we will labor in love, through love, and your revolutionary love is the magic we will show our children. Vaiguru Ka Khalsa, Vaiguru Ki Fateh.
Wow.
Oh, Catherine.
It's so powerful. I've watched it so many times and it just like gets me every time.
I will never forget that night. It was like, you know, that question that had been keeping me alive in those dark hours and days after the election was suddenly a question I had just like offered the world.
Yeah.
and everyone seized it. And
Yes.
I remember a few weeks later, it was the Women's March, you know, millions of people in the streets, and I was marching with my son, and I saw that question on protest signs. And it became like a mantra of the movement. And it's been almost 4 years, and that question I continue to ask myself every single day. And I don't know, Catherine, I is this the darkness of the tomb or the darkness of the womb? I think it's both. Now I believe it's both. Like what I just saw, the last death toll, 135,000 people dead in this country from a virus that was preventable if we had competent leadership. The scale and scope of it disproportionately impacting people of color.
Yeah.
Thinking about all the people we've lost from state violence and police violence and hate violence under this administration. All those lives that we can't get back. Like that is the darkness of the tomb.
Yeah. It's dark.
And at the same time, right, we're in the midst of a national reckoning around racial justice and Black lives that honestly, I never thought that I would see in my lifetime. Like millions of us grieving and raging and rising together, affecting all 50 states, every industry, every arena of our public life turned upside down in this long overdue reckoning. And I don't know what the future is going to hold, but I see the potential. I see the longing for the America that wants to be born.
Yeah.
So all I can do is keep breathing and pushing.
Yeah.
Breathing and pushing with you. And I have to say this is why, and this is why I'm so grateful to be spending these few minutes with you, Catherine, because Shoulder to Shoulder has been at the forefront of fighting anti-Muslim violence and hate in America for a decade of laboring tirelessly. And I have seen you as my sister laboring tirelessly. And now as a mother to 2 young children, it's hard labor and it's long labor and it feels like it's impossible labor. And there's like, I keep thinking like hope is a feeling that waxes and wanes, you know. Some days I feel hopeful and other days I just like, it's like a bare like sliver of a crescent moon, like it's barely there. And yet we still wake up each day and do the work. And I've seen you do the work year after year, month after month, day after day. And I'm so grateful to be here with you.
Oh, thank you.
Great anniversary with you all.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so inspired by you, and I think that the idea that this hope waxes and wanes, that's such a great way of thinking about it. But it's there, even when it's like new moon.
Right.
It's there, just like realizing that it's there. And I think that we talk about faith in our work, and we've as a staff and in a lot of our conversations with folks we're working with across the country, we talk about this idea of faith not just belonging to religious traditions, but this idea of faith in something greater, in something ahead of us is what I mean. Like, I think that faith and hope being so intertwined that none of us could keep doing the work if we didn't believe that it was possible to bring something more beautiful about. So
the radical thing is that even if we don't see it in our lifetime. Right.
And many haven't.
Right.
Many who have labored in this, who have worked in this, who thought that it was perhaps around the corner. Maybe they've seen certain wins, certain victories, certain spaces in which they feel that pieces have come around, but so many have worked so hard and haven't seen it in their lifetime, and I think that's important for us to remember as well. In an era of instant gratification, we can't see this work that way.
Don't you feel that when you look into the eyes of your babies?
My word, it's just such a powerful experience, and it's changed. I mean, I started with Shoulder to Shoulder in 2014. It's the 10th anniversary of the campaign this year. But when I started, I was not yet a parent. And I think that that has really shifted the work for me in so many ways and has called me into the work in new ways. I remember actually knowing, but not having shared yet, that I was pregnant during the Women's March, and marching with my child in my belly, and feeling just this sense of urgency around this country, around our world, but specifically thinking about this country, and what sort of country I want to be building for my now children. And it was really a powerful shift for me in thinking about the work, and in being able to see it, as you say, through the eyes of our children, and through the hope of our children, like this incredible positivity, and I think you earlier used the word magic, that they have that. So it helps.
Can I tell you a story?
Please.
It was shortly before the pandemic. my son, who was at the time 4 years old, was riding on the shoulders of my father. They had gone to a park in a concert in a park. And my son was just on top of the world. He was listening to the music, and then he was riding on my father's shoulders coming back home. And we lived close to a little marina. And so he wanted to take the ferry across the marina. He was so excited. And they were waiting when my father heard an irate voice. And there was a woman who was a white woman who was arguing with the ferry conductor. My father, like so kind, ever trying to be helpful, intervenes and saying, well, you can just walk this way and you'll get there. And the woman takes one look at him and says, go back to the country you came from. And my father is hard of hearing. So my son has to tell my father what the woman said. My parents come home and my son comes home, and my parents are shaken. And I said, didn't anyone say anything? And they said, no. Like, there were bystanders, a group of people watching, and they didn't say anything, just like last time when the racial slur was sand nigger, or the time before that when it was suicide bomber. And I was feeling so furious, but I had to mother my child, right? So I had asked Covey, where do you feel the sadness in your body? And I kissed his belly and stroked his forehead as he was floating off to sleep. And then my mind was racing, Catherine. I was just like, here I am. Yes, I'm many things. I'm an activist. I'm a lawyer. I'm a filmmaker. I can do all these things, but I can't keep my children safe. I can't keep my parents safe. And I was feeling like red hot rage just coursing through my veins. And suddenly my son puts his ear on my mouth and he says, Mommy, I not hear you breathing. And he says, you have to breathe to sleep, Mommy. And then he says, breathe and push, Mommy. Just breathe and push.
Wow.
Catherine, I had no idea he knew anything about what I did in the world or what I said in the world. And I thought, oh my God, my son has become my midwife.
That is heartbreaking and so beautiful at the same time.
I think it's what you said about, your babies are still small, but I think by modeling for them courage and resilience in the labor, they learn it before language even. And then they turn around and give it to you in your moments of need. And then you realize, oh, we're just laboring in this together. I feel like the meaning of life is to labor with joy. Is to labor with joy. And my children now are helping me do that better and better.
Yeah. Yeah.
No matter how long this lasts, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. So I want to look back together, and I want to just, before we jump into that piece of the conversation, I want to just let everyone know about your incredible new book. In case they haven't seen it, it's See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love. And it's incredible. You do such a beautiful job weaving your own story in very deeply personal ways into the story of this country and the story of our world, the story of your faith, the story, all these big picture stories. You do such an incredible job bringing your own experience and reflection into that. So just want to start by saying bravo. Thank you for bringing this beautiful, beautiful work into the world. And I found it also, it's a memoir, it's a manifesto, but I also found it to be a guide. Like, you walk through so many pieces of how to do this, not just reflecting on what's going on, but really, I think, giving some really powerful tools to anyone who is wanting to fight together for a better world, for a better America. You give so many tools that I think people can grab onto and live into. And so just so grateful for the way in which it's also a guide.
Thank you. After that, it's all connected. After that watch night address, it went viral. It was like 40 million views around the world. And I was so overwhelmed, totally overwhelmed by people reaching out to me saying, okay, I'm in, but how do we breathe?
Yeah.
How do we push?
Yeah.
And I knew that I knew in here, but I didn't know what to tell them. And
Yeah.
frankly, I was feeling pretty breathless.
Mm.
In those weeks after this president took power. It happened, the first Muslim ban. I mean, it was so relentless.
Mm.
And I realized that I needed to answer these questions for myself as much as for anyone else. And so I went away for a long time. I spent the last 3 years writing this book. I poured through the stories of my life. I poured through stories of social movements of the past. I poured through neuroscience and the science of human behavior. And I began to see these patterns and began to call them practices of revolutionary love. So the result is the book that you're holding in your hands. It's these 10 core practices around what it means to wonder and grieve and fight and rage and listen and reimagine. And these practices now I feel like are keeping me alive.
Yeah.
And my hope is that, just as that question was so useful back in 2016, my hope is that this book now, I just want to put this book in the hands of anyone who feels breathless or tired or lost or wanting to find a way to last in the work. Yeah, so I'm so happy that it's in your hands.
Yes, no, it's such an important offering, and I, it already has been that to me, in the sense of reminding me and calling me back into this work in a deep way that can feel so tiring on so many levels. But I think, during while we're in a pandemic, and for me personally, like balancing time with my children with figuring out, carving out time for work and all of these pieces, it's, I think, such a necessary, the practices there are so helpful in calling into this work and in creating space for ourselves in it, and for how we're engaging with others, even as the world is so tumultuous and unpredictable around us in a variety of ways that hit different communities in different ways. So I do want to look back with you. So this is, as you noted, the 10th anniversary of Shoulder to Shoulder. We're marking it. We have had conversations about, do we call it celebrating our 10th anniversary? We don't really want to celebrate the fact that 10 years after the formation of a campaign focused on standing alongside American Muslims to resist anti-Muslim discrimination and to create an America that values people of all beliefs and backgrounds, that we still have to be doing this work. So we in certain ways, we want to celebrate the ways in which people of faith, communities of faith have risen up. And have really, we see so many beautiful examples at the national level and really across the country of people coming together. I think of Louisville, Kentucky, which is in my home state, of when there have been houses of worship vandalized, the thousands of people who have shown up and ended up blocking major highways to help repaint. And these sorts of stories of people showing up and coming together. And I think we're in a moment now where people more readily have done some of the work of building these infrastructures of solidarity and of showing up for one another. And at the same time, the issues that are tied up in this are I mean, in many ways, I think folks would frame them as worse. They've been institutionalized. Anti-Muslim discrimination has received more institutional support and has been woven into some of the structures and the laws that, I mean, you mentioned the Muslim ban as just one example. And so in that way, we are talking as Shoulder to Shoulder about marking this time and it being kind of a messy tying up of all of those different things, the places we've come in positive ways, and the ways in which this issue has become all the more urgent and difficult in so many ways, and complex. And I know you've been in this work for well over a decade. But in your book, you point to the horrific shooting at the Gurdwara at Oak Creek as one of the formative moments in your call as an activist. And we're coming up in a few weeks on the 8th anniversary of that. And so kind of thinking about these different moments, I want to ask you to reflect with me over the last, looking over the last decade, how you've seen things change for better and for worse. Like where are we a decade later?
I want to begin where I believe the new era that we are in first was initiated. And that is in the aftermath of September 11th. We struggled with anti-Muslim, anti-Sikh, racial violence for decades before 9/11. After the Iran hostage crisis, after the Oklahoma City bombing, after the first Gulf War, there were spikes in hate violence against our communities. But 9/11 was a watershed moment that initiated a new era in our country for our communities. We today are 5 times more likely, Sikhs and Muslims, to be targets of hate today than we were before 9/11. But going back to what that moment was like for me, that's the moment when I remember becoming an activist. I never planned to be an activist. I was going to be an academic. I was going to be a professor of religion. I was a 20-year-old college student. And in the wake of the horror of the Twin Towers falling and the 3,000 deaths of Americans, we saw hate violence spread across city streets, all across the country. And Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh father, was the first person to be killed in a hate crime after the 9/11. He was someone my family knew, so it was a family friend. And I remember thinking that if people just knew his story, then the violence would stop. And so I was 20, I left college, I had a camera, I drove across the country, I captured the Sodhi family stories, and I captured, like, from city to city, from Gurdwara to Gurdwara, from mosque to mosque, hundreds of stories of how our aunties and uncles in our community were surviving acts of hate. There's 1,600% increase in hate violence in the year after 9/11, almost 24 people killed in the year-long aftermath. And this was before social media, right? This was before we had any other tools to tell our story. So I had an old dinky camera and started to make what became my first documentary film. The purpose of that first film, Divided We Fall, was simply to tell people that we were victims. Just the fact of violence happening to us was something that was buried beneath the national anthem. Yeah. And I think back to our generation of Sikh and Muslim advocates, how we had this mindset of if people just knew what we were suffering, then we could marshal the resources to stop it. And so we, and I'll read you an excerpt from See No Stranger, because I think it captures how I feel about it. I had always called the victims of hate crimes just that, victims. We as Sikhs were invisible victims. And so I thought that our role as advocates was to call the nation's attention to our suffering, to jump up and down and wave our hands in the air and ask America to see us. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American advocates jumped into action to respond to the onslaught of discriminatory policies by the state. So hate violence was soon followed by state violence, right? And hate crimes in the street. But the threats, we called it the backlash. We called it the backlash. We thought of it as like the sliver of American history that we would look back on with disgust and regret. But the backlash never ended. The threats never ceased. And we know that during the Obama era, a multi-million-dollar industry emerged to produce anti-Muslim propaganda, because now it was politically expedient for the GOP for so many conservative leaders to use anti-Muslim violence to score votes. So now it's, before there was like bipartisan consensus around anti-Muslim violence, at least in rhetoric, in the aftermath of 9/11, on the lips of George W. Bush. That changed under the Obama era. So the institutionalization that you're talking about really began to seep in, and we became masters of crisis management. We built infrastructure for crisis management. We got funded for crisis management. Crisis management protects victims from immediate harm. It does not easily make space for those victims to be seen as survivors who have something to teach the rest of the nation. It's been almost 20 years of the backlash of crisis management. And what is giving me hope is that in the last few years, and for me, this all changed for me in Oak Creek, when I witnessed my community rise up in the wake of that atrocity, of that massacre by a white supremacist, and saw how we grieved together and how we organized together and how we reimagined together, I thought, oh, okay, 6 has something to teach America about how to respond to the violence of white nationalism, socially, politically, and spiritually. I saw the practices of revolutionary love at work. We wondered, we grieved, we fought, we raged, we listened, we reimagined, we breathed, we pushed. This book is an attempt for me for not just to say, hey, we're suffering, but to say, hey, we have something to offer you about what it means to be agents of revolutionary love, how we can actually transition our nation into a nation where every single one of us is safe. And I see this for many of us, Catherine. I see this for many thought leaders and movement leaders, and for many organizations. We're finally demanding more funding for culture work, for not just resistance, but for reimagination. We're finally taking ownership of the new narratives that we could offer the country. And that's the sea change that I'm seeing. The threats are just as intense, and yes, worse under this presidency. And we don't know how much worse it's going to get. But I see us moving from that kind of rapid response frame as the only frame to being able to marshal more and more of our wisdom and imagination to offer the nation. You see that?
I do. I mean, I think, you know, when Shoulder to Shoulder began, it was about statements. And I think the statements were important, like the physical shows of solidarity through press conferences and people coming together and saying, this is not okay. This is not who we want to be. I think that those statements were important. But at some point we, as a campaign, and I think as a field more generally, I agree, like had to kind of look at this perpetual crisis management response, and actually think about what we want to be creating. And that's one of the questions we're asking right now is, you know, not just where have we been, but what are we trying to create together? And I think that's a question we're perpetually asking. I don't think there's an answer to it that we're going to find and then, you know, build out projects that support that answer or something. I think it's something that we have to keep asking as we walk in this work. Go ahead.
I just think you are so poised to live into this question, because what you do at Shoulder to Shoulder is model multi-faith solidarity. Model Muslims, Christians, Jews, Sikhs, standing Buddhists, Hindus side by side. And I saw that in Oak Creek. I mean, that's what was so singular and surprising and powerful and revolutionary about what happened in the wake of Oak Creek, was to see multi-faith solidarity that frankly our community had never seen in those numbers and in that strength before. And I think about, like, Dr. King calls for the beloved community. I feel like we birth the beloved community by becoming the beloved community, by modeling it in pockets here and now. And so you've made the statements, but every time you have brought faith leaders together to show what not just peaceful coexistence, but revolutionary love looks like in community, we are showing the country what might be possible for all of us.
Oh, I think that's so right. And it's often in, I mean, there's the sort of flashy moments that the news captures, but one of the big reflections I've had in kind of looking back over the last several years of work is that it really is the little moments, the little, the things that seem not like earth shattering to people to show up, to send a letter, to do, all these little things that build this like solid, sort of stronger social infrastructure, the beloved community that you're talking about. Like, it takes, to build community takes all of these little points of interaction, of showing up, of listening, of learning, of being quiet sometimes, of being loud sometimes. And all of these pieces together are what moves us forward. And so, that it's kind of like what we see in those big moments of coming together, but it's also what all the stuff that happens in between that allow those big moments to happen as well. So I want to talk about love. And I want to read actually a quick, well, maybe not so quick passage from your book about this, because I think it's so powerful. So if you cringe when people say that love is the answer, I do too. The problem is not with love, but the way we talk about it. We mostly talk about love as a flood of emotion, but feelings alone are too fickle and fluid to sustain political action. Social reformers through history led entire nonviolent movements anchored in love as an ethic. And then you go on to say, I believe we can reclaim love as a force for justice for a new time. I want to hear you talk about, I want folks listening to hear you talk about how you think about love, and how you think about love as a revolutionary force, as a public ethic, rather than something that is tied up in a surface level understanding of emotion.
Yeah. I remember that first moment when my son was placed on my chest after he was born, and I was just shaking and sobbing from like that rush of oxytocin just flooding my body. And I thought, oh, I'm falling in love. This is what it feels like. And it's what it feels like to fall in love. In the meantime, my mother is opening up her bag and getting out the doll and Joel and beginning to feed me, like starting to feed me as I was feeding her baby as I was feeding my baby. And I remember looking at her and thinking, oh, she has never stopped laboring for me. From my birth to my son's birth and now my daughter's birth. She knew what I was just beginning to wake up to, that love is more than that rush of feeling, that love is sweet labor. It is fierce and bloody and imperfect and life-giving, and it is a choice that we make over and over and over again. And that kind of love, when you think about love as labor, and any caretaker knows this, children, if you're taking care of children or parents or friends, when you think about laboring in that way, it contains all of the emotions, right? Joy is the gift of love. Grief is the price of love. Anger, our anger is the force that protects that which is loved. I always thought that love, the opposite of love was rage. No, the opposite of love is indifference. Like, so how do we marshal all of those emotions in laboring for those we love? And I thought about how I'm a lawyer. So anytime people said love was the answer, I always rolled my eyes and I cringed because I thought of thoughts and prayers and no action. And I was returned to the metaphors that I grew up with as a child in my Sikh faith. The model in the Sikh faith is the Sant Sipahi, the warrior sage. The warrior fights, the sage loves. It's a revolutionary kind of love. And so if we think about love as revolutionary, love as labor, when we pour that kind of labor beyond what evolution requires toward others, towards even our opponents, towards ourselves, who we too often neglect, that's how I see love becoming revolutionary.
Yeah.
And like any labor, right? It can be taught, it can be modeled, it can be practiced. So how do we practice love together, not just in our families, but in our movements, in our communities, in our country? I think revolutions happen in these big, grand public moments like what we are seeing. But revolutions also happen. For them to last, they must happen in the spaces where people are coming together to inhabit a new way of being.
Mm.
And so my hope and my invitation is that, just as Dr. King did in the civil rights movement, there's so many of us now, so many women of color now who are reclaiming love as a force for justice for this time. And this book is my, and this framework is my offering for how to do that now, how to stay in labor.
Yeah. Thank you. So one of the things that stood out to me in reading was you talking about the different roles people have in the labor. And there was a section, I think it's in the section you're talking about loving your opponents and listening, being a part of that. And you say that those who are made unsafe by that are not the people who need to be standing there listening to, for instance, somebody with white supremacist views, and thinking about the different roles that people in this have, kind of, just thinking about the different identities that we're bringing into this space. And on top of that, I want to ask you to speak to that. And in that also, around thinking about the multiplicity of justice issues that there is a spotlight on now, or perhaps there's not a spotlight on today, but a few weeks ago or something, like thinking about the major ways in which all these different justice issues are coming together, and in thinking about roles in the labor and where we find ourselves, where we fit ourselves into that labor, knowing how important it is for us to see all these intersections, and at the same time, figuring out how to navigate our work in this space, and thinking about the loving yourself piece, and not. I think we just hear from a lot of people who are, faith leaders, for instance, in different communities, who feel pulled in so many different directions to these issues that are not separate issues, and at the same time sometimes show up in different ways or are treated as separate issues, and just that kind of like mess of figuring out how to deal with all sorts of different issues of injustice that are overlapping and intersecting, and at the same time figuring out where to put yourself.
Yes. I like the word role literacy. Like, I think our primary task when we want to show up is to be literate in our role in any given time, in any given context. And everybody has a role in the labor of revolutionary love. So what is yours in this moment? It may not be what it was in the previous moment in your life. What is it now? And I talk about loving others, loving our opponents, and loving ourselves. And even in that 3-part framework, there may be a different place that you need to be. For example, I in this book, there are stories. I sit with white supremacists. I sit with prison guards and soldiers, and I sit with former abusers to try to listen to them and practice loving them. And it is difficult and hard labor. But in this moment, when I am trying to keep my family and my community safe under this administration, when you have a boot on your neck, it is not necessarily your role in that moment to look up at your oppressor and try to wonder about him or try to practice loving him, right? Your job, like this is what I write, if you find yourself in harm's way right now, then it is not necessarily your role to listen to the people who are terrorizing you or tend to any kind of wound in them. Your primary responsibility is to survive, find safety, tend to the wounds they inflict on you, build bonds with people who are willing to wonder about you, grieve with you, and fight with and for you. In finding ways to breathe, you are creating the kind of energy and joy that can sustain all of us in the struggle. This is your act of revolutionary love. So many Black people, undocumented people, brown people, indigenous people under this virus, under this pandemic, and under this onslaught of state violence, this is where we're at. But by virtue of whatever privilege you have, if you find yourself safe enough to do the brave work of listening to your opponents, you have a vital role to play. And I tell the story of Sister Simone Campbell, who holds these listening tours around the country, who sits with disaffected white people and listens beneath their slogans and sound bites. She hears their story and she listens to their pain and she helps them grieve. Like they have unresolved grief. They're grieving the illusion that this nation ever belonged to them in the first place. You know, I don't think it's legitimate grief, but that doesn't mean someone still doesn't need to tend to it and to help them, to transition them, so that, and then she comes back to me and gives me information so that I can hold up a vision of a nation that includes them too. Yeah. So she's doing the work that I can't do right now. And I think of so many white people who are ready to be allies. And I think, okay, it's time for us. This is taken from the Indigenous community. It's time for us not just to be allies, but to become accomplices, to conspire with us to break these chains of oppression. And that means there are probably people in your life, in your neighborhood, in your church, in your house of worship, on your street, in your family, who you could sit with and listen with and tend their wounds and help them and be transformed by them in turn, so that we can get to the other side of this. Everyone has a role at any different time. Yeah. At any given moment.
Thank you.
And then your second question about like, how do we, this moment where we know that all of our struggles for liberation are interconnected. How do we know where to put ourselves? As a Sikh activist for a long time, I had this notion that all of our struggles in this country had equal weight. There was the Sikh struggle and the Black struggle and the brown and the undocumented struggle and the Indigenous, and all of our struggles are bound up in one greater struggle for liberation. That's where I was for a long time. Until a series of experiences, which I talk about in the book, woke me up to the fact, every society in this world has been organized by a hierarchy of human value. In the United States, the oldest and most insidious and the most powerful ordering of that hierarchy of human value has been anti-Black racism. Yeah. And if I am serious about liberation in this country, that I, as a Sikh activist, have to center Black lives in my work. Just as we have to center Black lives, or I have to center Black lives, I had to wake up to the fact that, you know, on the farmlands I grew up on in California, where my family had settled 100 years ago, there were Indigenous people once. And the most documented genocide in America happened in California. There's blood in my farmland. And that the histories of the Americas have to start with Indigenous histories and Indigenous wisdom. And we have to think about Indigenous people as the ones in this country who have been the oldest climate activists, activists for climate justice before we even had those words. And so I think about, if I know that I am in places that are committed to liberation, when there are places that center Black lives, that begin with Indigenous recognition and Indigenous wisdom, and where women of color are leading, are part of leadership, because women of color who are also undocumented or disabled, or in some other way have had to struggle against poverty or other isms, carry in their body and their breath the knowledge of how to hold up movement strategies and movement visions that don't leave anyone behind. So they're not hard and fast rules, but those are helpful to me. Center Black lives, start with Indigenous wisdoms, make sure women of color are leading. And in those spaces, then you can work on any issue. And if that's your framework, then you are leading in this transformative way. Yeah.
That's so beautiful and helpful. I think you have such a beautiful mix of poetic and practical in everything that you offer. I think and just really appreciate that so much.
And I want to say, this is hard for because Shoulder to Shoulder has been dedicated to fighting anti-Muslim violence, and so that has been the center frame, right?
Right.
And I have been so focused on what it means to keep Sikh Americans safe.
Yeah.
And so how do we keep doing this work and center Black lives?
Yes. Yeah.
I woke up when to this idea of how to do it when I remember sitting in a cafe and I heard a group of white men in the table next to me say sand nigger over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And I confronted them because I was writing about revolutionary love. I have to think about them as my uncles, not as some bigot. So I confronted them and I told them, this is what this word means to me when I hear you say it. And I said, I wouldn't have come over here if I didn't see you as my uncles. I need you to see me as your sister or your niece. And that's what created a little bit of transformation. They could hear my story a little bit, but one of them stayed back and said, fine, you're not a sand nigger. He's not a sand nigger. And I apologize for saying this word so much, but he said, if you line up 10 Black people, 7 of them are niggers and 3 of them are people. And I thought, you don't believe every human being is a person. And he said, no, I don't. Catherine, I never woke up to the fact that Black Lives Matter is just not true on its face for an alarming segment of people in this country, explicitly or just implicitly. For this man, it was explicit. And his words kept playing in my mind over and over. And I finally heard it. The word nigger is inside of the word sand nigger.
Yeah.
All of the violence that we are fighting against Muslims and against Sikhs has its root in anti-Black oppression and anti-Black racism. Yeah. And so to see how any civil rights we have been won by Black Americans in civil rights movements and decades before that, since the inception of this country, is to also see that there are ways to center and lead with their vision of what an anti-racist society could be. And that's how we get created too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's so important. You point out at some point in the book that white supremacy has always been tied up in Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism. And I think that how we think about solidarity work in this space, how we think about interfaith work more broadly, and how it's tied up in all of this. I think the points you're making here are so important and are challenging to sometimes reorient our work or how we've thought about our work and broaden the lens, broaden the lens from the issue we think we're working on, and understand how tied up anti-Muslim and anti-Sikh discrimination is, for instance, in white supremacy, and the Christian roots of that as well, which is difficult and I think there's been, I think that a lot of the Christian denominations and organizations that we work with as part of Shoulder to Shoulder have made lots of strides in listening and learning on that front. And it's work of continuing to integrate these pieces. And that's an internal struggle for us at Shoulder to Shoulder too, to figure out how to orient our work in a way that honors and uplifts that in what we're doing. So we're running short on time, which is I can't believe it. No, it's this is so good. I want to throw you a couple of questions that have come off of the Facebook interaction, and then in the end, I want to ask you where we're going and how we get there.
Okay.
So just some, small questions for the last couple of minutes. But a couple that have come up on Facebook, and I'm going to read them both and let you kind of speak to them, and maybe you can transition into where you see us going. One is, in the long labor for our nation, for our country waiting to be born, we are hopeful and expecting to birth new life. But how do we navigate the possibility and reality of facing death and loss in the midst of this long labor? So that's one piece. Why don't we speak to that, and then I'll ask you the other one.
We will face death and loss in this long labor. In fact, we have for decades now. Mm-hmm. And I'll read this piece to you, going back to this, how Black lives have taught us how much we have to suffer in that long labor. America does not know how to grieve Black lives because doing so would mean accepting that there was never complete abolition. Slavery transmuted into segregation, which morphed into discriminatory laws and now into policies that appear neutral on their face, but still disparately violate people of color. New horrors keep arising from old impulses. The past keeps bleeding into the present. What is particular to America is that so many who suffered enormous loss and destruction have had to do so alone. A nation that cannot see its own past cannot see the suffering it has caused. A nation that cannot see our suffering cannot grieve with us. A nation that cannot grieve with us cannot know us, and therefore cannot love us. But, and this is your role, there have always been people who did what the nation as a whole did not. They crossed the line and took the hand of someone who did not look like them and wept with them as if to say, you are grieving, but you do not grieve alone. America's greatest social movements were rooted in the solidarity that came from shared grieving. There were always people who rushed to bury the dead, cut down the lynching noose, or attended the memorials to say, not in my name. When people who have no obvious reason to love each other come together to grieve, they can give birth to new relationships and even revolutions. So in this long labor for justice, grieving together is a core practice of revolutionary love.
Yeah.
It's what releases the energy in the relationships to create change together. So I say be with your group.
Thank you. I think that connects in certain ways to me for what you were saying about rage too, in the book, and the importance of rage in this. And I think this connects to this idea of loss and death in the midst of this too. And as somebody who has grown up in the Christian tradition, I resonated with, you point to Jesus and the money changers, the story of Jesus and the money changers, and say that the aim of divine rage is not vengeance, but to reorder the world. And that if we're going to be raging on the way to love, and you point out, of course, that the opposite of love is not rage, but indifference, and rage is part of love, that we have to, that it can't be about vengeance. It's about reordering the world. And grief is so tied into that.
So grieving together, raging together. And what does it mean to be an accomplice? Being an accomplice is not just being someone who makes space for that grief and holding people in their grief, but is also someone who helps the rest of the country understand our righteous rage.
Yeah. And not ask the people who are feeling that righteous rage most directly to be the ones interpreting it for everyone.
Yes, that's it. And that's what, again, makes me so excited about this moment, that people, never before have white people, non-Black people, and Black people come together to grieve together, to rage together, and to rise up together. And when we see white people form a wall in front of Black people kneeling in the streets in front of an army of police officers with their batons out, I mean, these images, they capture what it looks like, how people have different roles, and how we can make each other strong when we know what our roles are in any moment. And the role of accomplices, I'm like, what if this is a generation that gave whiteness a new meaning? Yeah. Whiteness was no longer synonymous with domination or with blindness, but with what it means to be an accomplice. Like, that's my greatest hope for this generation.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you. I want to throw one more question that came up on Facebook before we close. I know we're going a couple of minutes over. I hope that's okay. Is that okay with you? Okay.
I could be with you forever.
Yeah. We'll be here till our children are going to sleep. So the question is, while the Black Lives Matter movement is occurring, many communities, and this is, I think, from a Muslim partner who's tuning in, sorry. Many communities are trying to stay afloat with their own struggles. I often hear them ask, what about us? What's a good way to explain their lives matter to, without moving into an all lives matter framework? Though right now we are focusing on the lives of African Americans without making them feel unimportant. So what's a good way to explain that other marginalized voices matter while focusing on the lives of Black lives?
Oh, I think the key is not to have to explain it, but
Yeah.
to model it, to continue to tell your stories. And as you tell your stories, say that we stand in solidarity with our Black sisters and brothers and siblings. And we know if Black people are free, we are all free. I think that there is a sort of scarcity model that we have digested in activism and movement building, a sort of economy of sorts, where it's like it's a zero-sum game. If they get the spotlight, we don't, and we do live in an infrastructure capitalistic system that makes us feel that way. But what if we have the ability now to create new channels and new platforms for telling our stories and for organizing together and for mobilizing people in ways that didn't exist 20 years ago? So that old scarcity model, can we just let it float out the window? And instead, can we just continue to do our work? Continue to do our work well, to tell our stories, to raise the resources that we need, and to marshal the language to make it clear that this is also centering Black lives while not leaving anybody behind. I think you've done that at Shoulder to Shoulder. You're showing us how to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I think you really, in certain ways, answered this earlier too, in noting that it all stems from anti-Black racism in this country. And so understanding that when we are addressing anti-Black racism, that it's not like, okay, then we're going to move on to addressing these other forms of discrimination. That is where the roots are. And so we're dealing with pulling up roots rather than seeing it as something that's sequential in some way.
Yes.
Okay, so my last question, which I know is a huge question, and you could spend hours and hours responding to it, but where do you see us going?
In 25 years, this country will be a minority majority country. The number of people will exceed the number of white people for the first time since colonization. And I believe that we are at a crossroads. Will we birth a nation that has truly never been on the face of the planet, a nation made up of other nations, right? A nation that is truly multiracial, multi-faith, multi-gendered, where we are striving to protect the dignity and the wellness of every single one of us, where we see no stranger? Or will we continue to descend into a kind of civil war, a power struggle with those who want to return America to a past where only a certain class of white people hold cultural, political, economic power? I'm deeply invested in unseating this president in November. I am more invested in changing the conditions that brought him into power in the first place. And those conditions are not disappearing the day after the election. And so when we are talking about that long labor, it's about these two possible futures that are just, and it all depends on how many of us stay in the labor, how many of us stay in the labor, and if the millions of people who have been activated now under this administration have been flooding the streets for Black lives, who have maybe marched for the first time or held up a sign for the first time, they're going back into their homes, into their families, into their institutions, into their workplaces, into their houses of worship. There is no institution on the face of this country that does not need you right now, does not need us right now to transition it. And that transitional work into becoming a truly anti-racist society where every one of us has a role in that work, that is long work, that is generational work, that requires us to last. It requires us to breathe and push and breathe again. The midwife doesn't say breathe once and push the rest of the way. She says breathe, my love, and then push and then breathe again, because this is going to be one long labor. And so I am still in the darkness of unknowing, Catherine. I don't know what the next 10 years will hold or the next 25 years will hold. I do know that the only way that we will birth the America that we dream, the world that we want for our children, is if we stay in the labor and we labor with love and through love, through revolutionary love. And I want to grow old. Like, I want to grow old. I want to last. And I want to grow old with you. I want us to be old women one day looking back, at the labor that we poured into the world. And even if it continues on after we die, to last in that labor. I think revolutionary love is not only how we birth that future eventually, it is how we last.
Yeah.
It's how we last.
Yeah. Valarie, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm so grateful just for you, for the work that you're doing, for the love that you pour into your work and that you exude in everything that you do, and just for taking the time to be with us today. I know that time is precious, and we're just so grateful for your time, your energy, your wisdom, and your essence. So thanks for sharing with us today. I hope that everyone who is tuning in will pick themselves up a copy of See No Stranger, because I think it, like I said at the beginning, it's a guide. It answers, I think, in many ways, this question of how do we get there, and I think does that so well and so tangibly, and I really found it so valuable, and just grateful for you and for your work. So thank you.
And Catherine, we are starting a book club this summer as well. We just started it. And so if folks go to seenostranger.com, they can see the book. And if they wanted to read in community, they can sign up for these virtual book clubs.
Amazing.
And you'll even create their own book clubs. So that will happen through the summer. And then we'll be galvanizing together in getting out the vote in November. Awesome. And then staying in the labor long afterwards. So
I love it. Yeah. Awesome. Well, we'll make sure folks have the link to find that. So awesome. Well, thank you, Valarie. I hope that you have a good rest of the day, rest of the week. We at Shoulder to Shoulder have another of these conversations next month, August 4th, with Reverend Jennifer Bailey. So please return for that.
That is amazing.
Yes, she's incredible as well. So many incredible women activists who I know I have learned so much from, and I'm excited that we get to share your wisdom with the folks in our network and connected to us. So thank you. All right. Have a great rest of your day. I know.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.